those killed in the Sand Creek Massacre. After they were initially promised military protection, historians say U.S. troops brutally attacked the peaceful village of Cheyenne and Arapahoe. More than 230 women, children, and elders were ambushed and killed. After the massacre, the Cheyenne and Arapahoe people were forced to leave Colorado.
It's really important to present the whole story.
There were numerous massacres throughout U.S. history. The Dade Massacre, Wounded Knee Massacre, the Battle of Little Bighorn, all are horrible and uncalled for, but the Sand Creek Massacre is up there at the top with brutality. The Fort Laramie Treaty in 1851 was between the United States and 7 Indian nations, including the Cheyenne and Arapahoe. The Lakota Sioux received exclusive treaty rights to the Black Hills. The Northern Cheyenne people claimed this was their land. The U.S. recognized that the Cheyenne and Arapahoe held territory between the North Platte River and the Arkansas River east of the Rocky Mountains to West Kansas, a vast area, including present-day southeast Wyoming, southwest Nebraska, and most of eastern Colorado and the western portions of Kansas. But in November 1858, gold was discovered in the Rocky Mountains in Colorado, then part of Kansas Territory. This started the Pikes Peak Gold Rush. White settlers flooded across the Cheyenne and Arapahoe lands. This forced the whites and natives to fight over resources, and many settlers wanted to stay on the lands of the Cheyenne and Arapahoe people. Territorial officials pressured the U.S. federal authorities to rewrite the maps of the Indian lands in their territories. It was late 1860 when A.B. Greenwood, the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, arrived on the banks of the Arkansas River to a fort and trading post named Bent's New Fort. Bent's Old Fort was built in 1849 by William Bent. He built a wooden stockade for a fort and trading post. It was a U-shaped structure of 3 connected log cabins. The open side faced the Arkansas River. He then built a rectangular sandstone trading post and fort in the summer and early fall of 1853, built near Cheyenne and Arapahoe camping ground named Big Timbers. The new building with 16-foot walls had 12 rooms built around a central courtyard for defense. Cannons sat in the corners of the roof, and there were parapets. The original fort was destroyed by fire during a severe cholera epidemic in 1849, the year it was first built. The new fort was built on a hill overlooking the Arkansas River with a view for miles of the Santa Fe Trail in a defensive position situated between a limestone cliff and a rock bluff. A.B. Greenwood arrived here to negotiate a new treaty. February 18, 1861, 6 chiefs of the Southern Cheyenne and 4 of the Arapahoe signed the Treaty of Fort Wise. The treaty forced them to cede most of their land that had been designated to them by the Fort Laramie Treaty. The 6 Cheyenne chiefs included Black Kettle, White Antelope, Lean Bear, Little Wolf, and Tall Bear. The Arapahoe chiefs included Little Raven, Storm, Shavehead, Big Mouth, and Newat. The Cheyenne warriors denounced the chiefs who signed the treaty and even threatened them with death if they attempted to carry out the treaty and cede their land. The new Indian reservation was less than 1/13 the size of the original territory. It was located in eastern Colorado between the Arkansas River and the Sand Creek. The majority of the bands of the Cheyenne were angry at the chiefs who signed the treaty. They disavowed the treaty, which never received the blessing of the Council of 44, the supreme tribal authority. The Council of 44 comprised of 4 chiefs from each of the 10 Cheyenne bands, plus 4 principal chiefs who had previously served on the council. They refused to abide by the treaty, and they continued to live and hunt in the old territory of the Fort Laramie Treaty, the bison-rich lands of eastern Colorado and western Kansas. They became extremely angry over the extreme amount of white immigrants across their lands. The people who opposed the treaty said it had been signed by a small minority of chiefs without the consent or approval of the rest of the tribe, that the signatories had not understood what they signed, and that they had all been bribed by large distributions of gifts. U.S. officials thought the Indians who refused were hostile and were planning a war. The Cheyenne started committing minor offenses in 1861. But these went unpunished, ultimately becoming more significant. In 1863, Governor John Evans went to meet with the chiefs, but they did not show up at the appointed meeting place. Elbridge Gerry, the governor's guide, went out to find the chiefs. He returned 2 weeks later saying that a council had been held, wherein the chiefs decided not to meet with the governor. Bull Bear offered to meet with the governor, but his warriors would not allow it. By the end of 1863 and the beginning of 1864, word reached U.S. officials that an Indian coalition was to be formed among the Plains tribes to drive the whites out of the country. During the spring and summer of 1864, the Sioux, Comanches, Kiowas, Cheyenne, and Arapahoes were all engaged in hostilities leading to the murder of civilians, destruction of livestock and crops, and supplies being cut out of the region. Colorado settlers were in danger of starvation or murder at the hands of the Plains tribes. Cheyenne men were attacked by the 1st Colorado Cavalry Regiment on April 12th near Fremont's Orchard without an attempt of parley or peace before the attack. The next day, a herdsman for the Irving Jackman and Company gave reports that Cheyennes and Arapahoes had driven off 60 oxen, 12 horses, and mules from their camp south of Denver. George Bent, a half-Cheyenne, half-white man, disputed the version of the story. He stated, "One day in April, some Cheyennes from one of these camps were out hunting and found a number of oxen straying about among the sandhills. As they did not know whom the animals belonged, they drove them to camp, intending to keep them until someone could lay claim to them. The Indians had no use for oxen. There were plenty of buffalo on that range that winter, and the Indians never would eat tame meat when they could get buffalo. A group of soldiers led by Lieutenant Clark Dunn was sent out to retrieve the livestock. A confrontation erupted and resulted in the death of 4 of the soldiers. The tribes kept the stolen livestock. After this, Lieutenant George Erie was also sent to retrieve the stolen livestock. If the animals would not be returned, he was to attack the camp. Erie's orders were to parley first to see if the animals would be given freely. He went against the orders and attacked. Erie and his men burnt and plundered Crow Chief's band camp of 70 lodges, which they abandoned once they were alerted by his forces approaching. The men found, plundered, and burned Chief Coon's band camp. They also fled after being alerted by their scouts. May 16th, Lean Bear, Black Kettle, and others in the tribe were camping at the buffalo hunting grounds near Ash Creek. The 1st Colorado Regiment, commanded by Lieutenant George Erie, approached the group. Lean Bear went alone to meet the soldiers, thinking it would be a peaceful encounter. 15 months earlier, he had met with President Lincoln in Washington. He received a peace medal on that trip, and he held a document signed by President Lincoln stating he was peaceful and friendly. He approached the soldiers with his medal proud on his chest and his Lincoln document in hand. Lean Bear could not have known that Erie was under orders from Colonel John Chivington to kill Cheyennes whenever and wherever found. Erie ordered his men to shoot him. He was wounded and fell off his horse. The men repeatedly shot him as they rode past his body. The start of the American Civil War in 1861 led to military forces being organized in the Colorado Territory, but their goal was fixed on defeating the Confederates. As a result of this, wagon trains, settlers, communication lines, and supply wagons in the region were not protected by the military. But in 1864, nearly all of these were being attacked by the Native Americans. The settlers were cut off and were raided regularly. Settlers abandoned their farms and began to seek refuge in the major settlements such as Denver. August 8, 1864, a coordinated attack was carried out on all the existing stagecoach lines in the region. Governor Evans sent multiple letters to Secretary of War Edward Stanton, an attempt to gain military aid. But Stanton could not pull the 2nd Colorado Volunteers off of the Eastern Front, but authorization was given to form the 3rd Colorado Volunteers. Before the massacre of Sand Creek, there were 32 Indian attacks on record, resulting in 96 deaths of settlers, 21 wounded, and 8 captured. Between 250 to 300 livestock were stolen. 12 wagon trains were attacked, robbed, or destroyed, and 9 ranches and settlements were raided. On June 15, 1864, Major T.I. McKinney wrote to General Samuel Ryan Curtis, "I think if great caution is not exercised on our part, there will be a bloody war. It should be our policy to try to consultate them, guard our mails and trains well, to prevent theft and stop the scouting parties that are roaming over the country. who do not know one tribe from another, and to whom will kill anything in the shape of an Indian. It will require but a few murders on part of our troops to unite all these warlike tribes of the plains who have been at peace for years, and intermarried amongst one another. I do wish that some prudent good man could be placed in command of the troops along the road from the Smoky Fork on the Leavenworth Road to the Walnut Creek, and from Cow Creek throughout the Fort Lyon on the Kansas City or Old Santa Fe Road. Major T.I. McKinney. Conflict between the Indians and settlers, along with soldiers in Colorado, continued. The tribes made war during the spring and summer months, until winter, when the tribes would seek to make peace. Then they would stock up on supplies, arms, and munitions, and when fair weather returned, the war would commence anew. In 1864, Governor Evans sent a circular to the Plains Indians, inviting those who were friendly to go to Fort Lyon on the eastern plains, where they would be given provisions and protections by the United States troops. The circular was dated June 27th, and on September 28th, the Cheyenne came to Denver to have a peace talk with the governor. The chiefs were told that peace was not possible at that point, and whatever peace they must make will be with the soldiers and not with me. White Antelope said that he feared the soldiers might kill some of his people while he was there. The governor told him that there was great danger of it, and then he told White Antelope that one of the military chiefs was present and could tell the tribes what was necessary to secure peace. The governor made it very clear that the purpose of this circular was not to extend peace. The messages given at this meeting were highly contradictory. Governor Evans told the chiefs, "The time when you can make war is best in the summer. When I can make war is best in the winter. You so far have had the advantage. My time is just coming." On the other hand, Colonel Chivington told the chiefs that if they sought peace, they should come to Fort Lyon and be under the protection of Major Wynkoop. 652 Arapahoes, led by Chief Little Raven, appeared at Fort Lyon around November 6, 1864, and were subsisted there by Major Anthony, who had replaced Wynkoop. Later, when 600 Cheyenne appeared in the fort in a similar manner, they were turned away and denied subsistence by Major Anthony. Black Kettle led his 163 mostly Southern Cheyenne band, who were joined by some Arapahoes under Chief Newat, to Fort Lyon, in compliance with provisions of peace parley held in Denver September 1864. After a while, the Native Americans were asked to relocate to Big Sandy Creek, less than 40 miles northwest of Fort Lyon, under the threat of their safety. The Dog soldiers who were responsible for many of the attacks and raids on the whites were not part of this encampment. The Dog soldiers were a militaristic band of Cheyenne that had began in the 1830s. Many tribal warriors stood their ground and refused to leave their home under the guise of a threat. They left about 75 men, plus all the women and children in the village. Of the 75 men that were left, most of them were too old or too young to hunt. Black Kettle flew a United States flag with a white flag tied beneath it over his lodge, as the Fort Lyon commander had advised. This flag was to show that he was friendly and not to be attacked by the Colorado soldiers. Chivington and 425 men of the 3rd Colorado Cavalry rode to Fort Lyon. They arrived on November 28, 1864. Once at the fort, Chivington took command of 250 men of the 1st Colorado Cavalry and 12 men of the 1st Regiment New Mexico Volunteer Infantry. They then set out for Black Kettle's encampment. A frontierman who had lived with the Indians for 50 years acted as his guide. His name was James Becksworth. Prior to the attack, many officers were not eager to join in an attack against friendly Indians. Captain Salias Soule, Lieutenant Joseph Kramer, and Lieutenant James Connor protested the attack, which would violate the pledge of safety provided to the Indians and dishonor the uniform of the Army. The following morning, Chivington gave the order to attack. Two officers, Captain Salias Soule and Lieutenant Joseph Kramer, commanding D Company and K Company of the 1st Colorado Cavalry, refused to obey and told their men not to fire. But the rest of Chivington's men immediately attacked the village, ignoring the U.S. flag and the white flag that was run up shortly after the attack began. They murdered as many of the Indians as they could. Captain Salias wrote to Major Edward Wynkoop, "I refused to fire and swore that none but a coward would, for by this time hundreds of women and children were coming towards us and getting on their knees for mercy. I tell you, Ned, it was hard to see little children on their knees. I saw 2 Indians hold one another's hand, chased until they were exhausted. When they kneeled down and collapsed, each other's around their neck, and were both shot together. They were all scalped. You would think it was impossible for white men to butcher and mutilate human beings as they did there. Congressional testimony of Mr. John S. Smith. I saw bodies of those lying there all cut to pieces. Worse mutilated than any other I saw before. The women all cut to pieces with knives, scalped. All ages lying there, infants to warriors. By whom were they mutilated? By the United States troops. Robert Bent's and Major Anthony's New York Tribune articles from 1879 are too brutal to read. You will have to look them up yourself. Stan Hoig's testimony. Parts were cut off the bodies for the jewelry they carried. White Antelope's body, laying solitary in the creek bed, he was a prime target. The rest of the testimony I cannot read. Kit Carson to Colonel James Rustling. Just to think that dog Chivin and his dirty hounds up there at Sand Creek. His men shot down squaws. You call such soldiers Christians, do ya, and Indians savages? What do you suppose our Heavenly Father, who made both of them and us, would think of these things? I tell you what, I don't like a hostile redskin any more than you do, and when they are hostile, I fought 'em as hard as any man. But I never drew a bead on a squaw or a papoose, and I despise any man who would. The natives who were lacking artillery could not make up much of a resistance. Some of the natives reached horses from the camp's herd and fled up Sand Creek or to a nearby Cheyenne camp on the headwaters of the Smoky Hill River. Others, including George Bent, fled upstream and dug holes in the sand beneath the banks of the stream. They were pursued by troops and fired on, but many survived. Cheyenne warrior Morning Star said that most of the Indian dead were killed by cannon fire, especially those firing from the south bank of the river, at the people retreating up the creek. Chivington gave testimony before a congressional committee investigating the massacre. He claimed that as many as 500 to 600 Indian warriors were killed. Eyewitness John S. Smith reported that 70 to 80 Indians were killed, including 20 to 30 warriors. George Bent gave 2 different accounts of the native losses. In 1889, he wrote that 137 people were killed, 28 men and 109 women and children. In 1913, when he was very old, he wrote that 53 men and 110 women and children were killed, and many were wounded. Initial reports indicated that 10 soldiers were killed and 38 were wounded. The final tally was 4 killed and 21 wounded in the 1st Colorado Cavalry, and 20 killed or mortally wounded, and 33 other wounded in the 3rd Cavalry, adding up to 24 killed and 54 wounded. Before Chivington and his men left, they plundered the teepees and took all the horses. After this, Chivington's men came back and killed many of the wounded. Many were scalped, regardless if they were men, women, or children. Many of their body parts were taken off of the bodies, but I cannot tell you what and what they did with them. You will have to read to find that out yourself. It is too much for YouTube. It is said that 3 Indians in the village are known to have survived the massacre. George Bent's brother Charlie and 2 Cheyenne women survived the massacre in the village. The Sand Creek Massacre resulted in extreme loss of life, mostly among the Cheyennes and Arapaho women and children. After hiding all day above the camp in the holes they dug beneath the bank of the Sand Creek, the survivors there, many of whom were wounded, moved up the stream and spent the night on the prairie. Trips were made to the side of the camp, but very few survivors were found there. They spent a very cold night there, without any shelter. The survivors went towards the Cheyenne camp on the headwaters of the Smoky River. They met with other survivors who had escaped with the horses, some returning from the Smoky Hill camp where they had fled during the attack. They then proceeded to the camp where they received aid. The Cheyenne power structure was disrupted because of the massacre. 8 members of the Council of 44 died in this massacre. White Antelope, One Eye, Yellow Wolf, Big Man, Big Bear, War Bonnet, Spotted Crow, and Bear Robe were all killed. Some of the handmen of the Cheyenne military societies were also killed. Among the chiefs that were killed, most of them advocated for peace with the settlers and the United States government. They were at the camp as part of a peace parley to begin with, and were promised to be protected. Weakening of the peace faction resulted in part of the massacre, and they were greatly opposed by the younger and more militaristic Dog soldiers. The Sand Creek Massacre hurt the Cheyenne clan system and authorities of its council of chiefs. It was already weakened greatly by the numerous deaths due to the 1849 cholera epidemic, which killed around half of the southern Cheyenne population. It was weakened even more by the separate bands of the Dog soldiers. After the U.S.'s brutal slaughter of those who had supported peace, most of the Cheyenne, including Warrior, Roman Nose, along with some Arapaho, joined the Dog soldiers, and they sought vengeance on settlers throughout the entire Platte Valley. In 1865, an attack was made on what became Fort Casper in Wyoming. After the survivors of the massacre reached Smoky Hill, they passed the war pipe and smoked it. It then went from camp to camp along the Sioux, Cheyenne, and the Arapaho warriors. An attack was planned in January 1865 with 1,000 warriors on the stage station and fort of Camp Rankin, known as the Battle of Julesburg, on the 7th of January 1865. Their plan was to lure the soldiers out of Fort Rankin into an ambush and overwhelm them. Big Crow, a Cheyenne, picked 10 men as decoys. They charged the fort and then retreated in haste. Captain O'Brien led most of his men and some civilian volunteers out of the fort to chase the decoy. 3 miles from the fort, O'Brien had almost ridden into the ambush when 2 young Indian warriors prematurely fired at the soldiers, alerting him to the presence of a large number of warriors. The soldiers fled back to the fort with Indians in pursuit. They caught them 300 yards from the fort. Some of the soldiers were cut off. They dismounted and defended themselves, but were killed. The surviving soldiers and civilians, including Captain O'Brien, made it back to the shelter. 14 soldiers and 4 civilians were killed in the battle. It is said that no Indians were killed or wounded, although some of the soldiers claim they killed about 60. All of the civilians were hiding in the fort, and the Indians looted the stage station, store, and warehouse, carrying away a large amount of plunder. The soldiers in the fort fired a few artillery rounds at the Indians, but they were unaffected. This was followed by numerous raids along the South Platte, east and west of Julesburg. The bands captured a lot of goods and killed many settlers, including men, women, and children. Most of the Indians moved north into Nebraska on their way to the Black Hills and the Powder River country. After all this, Black Kettle continued to seek for peace. He did not join in the second raid or the journey to the Powder River country. He left the camp and returned with 80 lodges to the Arkansas River to seek peace with the Colorado people. Official investigations into the massacre, the Sand Creek engagement, initially was reported as victory against a brave and numerous foe. But shortly after this, witnesses and survivors began telling the stories of a possible massacre. Several investigations were conducted, 2 by the military and 1 by the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War. The panel declared this: "As to Colonel Chivington, your committee can hardly find fitting terms to describe his conduct. Wearing the uniform of the United States should be the emblem of justice and humanity, holding the important position of commander of the military district, and therefore having the honor of the government to that extent in his keeping, he deliberately planned and executed a foul and dastardly massacre, which would have disgraced the various savages among those who were the victims of his cruelty, having full knowledge of their friendly character, having himself become instrumental to some extent in placing them in the position of their fancied security. He took advantage of their inapprehension and defensiveness condition to gratify the worst passion that ever cursed the heart of man. Whatever influence this may have had upon Colonel Chivington, the truth is that he surprised and murdered in cold blood the unsuspecting men, women, and children on Sand Creek, who had every reason to believe that they were under the protection of the United States authorities, and then returned to Denver and boasted of the brave deed he and his men under the command had performed. In conclusion, your committee, are the opinion that for the purpose of vindicating the cause of justice and upholding the honor of the nation, prompt and energetic measures should be at once taken to remove from office those who have thus disgraced the government by whom they are employed, and to punish as their crimes deserve those who have been guilty of these brutally and cowardly acts. Statements written by Major Wynkoop and his adjutant substantiated the accounts of the survivors. The statements were filed with the reports and can be found on the official records of the War of the Rebellion, copies of which were submitted as evidence in the Joint Committee or the Conduct of War and in separate hearings conducted by the military in Denver. During these investigations, witnesses came forward with testimony that was damning against the U.S. military, corroborated by witnesses and survivors. Captain Salias Soul, who had ordered his men not to fire during the massacre, was murdered just a few weeks after his testimony in Denver. Despite the Joint Committee on the Conduct of War's recommendation, no charges were brought against any of those who committed the massacre. Chivington was beyond reach of any military justice because he had already resigned from his commission. The closest thing that he got to any punishment was he suffered the end of his political aspirations. After details of the massacre became widely known, the United States government sent a Blue Ribbon Commission, who were respected by the natives. The Treaty of the Little Arkansas was signed in 1865. It was signed by the United States of America, the Kiowa, Comanches, Plains Apache, Southern Cheyenne, and Southern Arapaho at the Little Arkansas River in October. It is notable that it lasted less than 2 years. The reservations it created for the Plains Indians were never created at all, and it was reduced by 90% 18 months later in another treaty. The white representatives wanted peace, unmolested traffic on the Santa Fe, and limitation of Indian territory. The Indians demanded unrestricted hunting grounds and reparations for the Sand Creek Massacre. This was one of the shortest treaties in the United States history. None of its provisions were ever met. None of its provisions were ever implemented on both sides. Charged violations and warfare continued until the Medicine Lodge Treaties of 1861. Under the Medicine Lodge Treaty, the tribes were assigned reservations with the depleted size compared to the territories defined in the 1865 treaty. The tribes never ratified the treaty by vote of adult males as it required. Allotment policy under the Dawes Act and authorizing sales under the agreement with the Cheyenne and Arapaho 1890 and the agreement with the Comanche, Kiowa, and Apache 1892. Because of the issues with the treaty and subsequent government actions, eventually the Kiowa, Arapaho, and Comanche filed several suits for claims against the United States government over decades. They won substantial settlements of monetary compensation, amounts of tens of millions of dollars, although it took years for the cases to be resolved. This was one of the worst massacres in the United States history, due to the brutality against the Native Americans by the U.S. soldiers. There were extreme cases of bodily dismemberment, with war trophies being displayed on U.S. wagon trains, in bars, on saddles, throughout the Colorado area, and back home with the soldiers. Unspeakable things were done, which I cannot state here. You will have to read on your own to find out for yourself exactly what was taken off of the Native Americans and the brutality that was done to the men, women, and children. The friendly Indians that were brought there by a circular distributed by the governor, offering to go to Fort Lyon as a place of safety. They were told to go to that camp and fly the U.S. flag and a white flag underneath to show that they were friendly Indians and were not to be attacked. And they were promised safety, a village of mostly men, women, and children, too old or too young to hunt. They were deceived and were butchered, some being chased down over miles. Stories from survivors and from soldiers that refused to partake in the slaughter, so horrible that you can barely read without tearing up. The Sand Creek Massacre was different. A massacre is never supposed to be clean and tidy, but compared to most, this one stands out for its savagery, with the false promises of safety and the severe butchery against friendly Indians, men, women, and children, and everything done to the dead after. The Sand Creek Massacre is one to remember, so that man will never repeat history. Often overlooked by larger massacres, history should never be forgotten, no matter how horrible. Thank you all for watching. Please leave a comment down below. I want to hear what you think about this story. I'd really appreciate it. and I will see you on the next one. Peace.